I'm Reverend Phil, and I'm your host for Words of the Prophets. Where are our prophets now? Where are those messengers God chooses to communicate divine revelation through? In the past, the Creator sent prophets like Abraham, Siddhartha, Jesus, Muhammad, and many more. Maybe our higher power has switched tactics since we reinterpret God's words as soon as the Creator's prophets leave us. Could it be that Spirit talks to each one of us individually and we haven't learned to listen? On Words of the Prophets, our modern prophets show us how to find the internal prophet that is the I Am, and we discuss the application of spiritual principles in all aspects of our lives.
Love and light, everybody. I'm Reverend Phil, and I'm your host for Words of the Prophets. Today, my guest is a good old favorite of ours, been with us forever, hopefully will be with us forever, is Reverend Dr. Richard Murphy, who is director of St. Bede's Episcopal Church here in Santa Fe. And today's prophetic topic is unity in diversity. And this topic comes from a statement made by Sri Chinmoy, who was an Indian spiritual teacher and philosopher. Very interesting fellow, if you want to look him up, Chinmoy. And the statement reads as follows: spirituality is not merely tolerance. It is not even acceptance. It is the feeling of a universal oneness. In our spiritual life, we look upon the divine not only in terms of our own God, but in terms of everybody else's God. Our spiritual life firmly and securely establishes the basis of unity in diversity. Spirituality is not hospitality to the other's faith in God. It's the absolute recognition of the other's faith in God as one's own. Because what we're going to do today, Father and I, are going to be talking about religious intolerance. It's been on the news pretty regularly now for the last couple of months, and it's been growing, I think, pretty rapidly. So before I turn this over to Father Murphy, I just want to give us a definition of intolerance. Intolerance is impatience with annoyances, unwillingness to recognize and respect differences in opinions or beliefs. So before we really get into the topic, you just want to let those few watchers who have not seen you before know who you are.
Well, you said it all. I'm the rector of St. Bede's Episcopal Church, and I'm in my 12th year now as rector. In November, I'll be beginning my 13th, and you and I have been friends for many, many years. And it's good to see you again.
12 of them.
11 or 12 of them.
Yes.
Sure. So it's good to be here.
Good to have you. What we're going to do is we're going to look at the problem, which is intolerance, what are its roots, and then we're going to look at what are the solutions. And, you know, Father Murphy is a perfect person for a lot of reasons, but one of them we'll touch on right now is that St. Bede's shares its facility with a Jewish congregation. Now, if that is not an example of unity and diversity, I'm not sure what is, you know. So, I mean, that's what we're going to touch on. But, yeah, the first question becomes, does religion, because of its inherent nature, create intolerance?
I don't think it's the religion so much per se. I think it's a lot of times the people who practice the religion. If you look at the core beliefs of all religions, or I'm not an expert in all religions, but you know, the core, at the core of all faith enterprises is the call to love, the call to community, the call to recognize a common humanity, and oftentimes it's our own human failings that get in the way, and we can, we can gum up the works. For instance, Islam is a faith of love and community, and it's some extremists who want to use it to their own ends that will try and twist it, and in the name of that religion go out and cause trouble. The same with Christian extremists, that they will use their faith to meet their own ends, when it's not their own ends that the religion is all about. It's God's ends.
Let me back this up for a second, because I hear what you're saying. You know, the golden rule is pretty much the same in every religion.
Right.
Yet, here's where, to me, it kind of breaks down. And I'm just Judaism considers themselves the chosen people. Roman Catholicism, up until recently, said they were the only direct path to God. Now they said, well, all the others are paths to God. We're just the best path to God. The Quran comes into being because of basically the information given Muhammad was, well, the other Abrahamic traditions got the message, but they've kind of messed it up, so we need to reinforce that message again. So, I mean, each one has this golden rule, yet each one has this other little, kind of opposition to that golden rule.
Yeah.
And does that create confusion, do you think?
Well, no, people can, as I said before, people can twist it for their own personal ends, whether they be political, whether they be social. Oftentimes, too, I think people twist and twist their own beliefs for some extreme ends out of fear, as much as anything. It's a fear of the other. It's a fear of listening to another voice, fear of learning something new. I always go back to, I'll date myself, to the old Smothers Brothers TV show. And it was one that was, 100 years ago or something that was on? They would do this dialogue at the end, the two of them, the brothers. And I always get Dickie and Tommy mixed up, but Dickie, I think it was, turns to Tommy and says, are you aware that there are 1,700 recognized religions in the world? And Tommy says, I had no idea. And Dickie said, well, what do you think they all have in common? And Tommy kind of hesitated and looked around, and then he looked at his brother and he said, well, that they all express a belief in God. And Dickie said, no, that they all claim they're the one true religion. And, that might have been on 20, 30 years ago, and I remember it because there's so much truth in it that we get defensive. I mean, my background, we'll get into it later, is Irish. I'm Irish American, and I've been involved in the peace process up in Northern Ireland to an extent, and that's based on religious differences. But if you talk to people within the conflict, they will try and divine the conflict a myriad of ways, but it comes down to the divisions between Protestant and Catholic that existed for generations.
So somewhere along the way, the message that the religion is putting out, even the contradictions within the message, are really being reinterpreted, misinterpreted by a group of people for their own purpose.
I think for their own purpose, sure.
So what we're talking about then is, how do we get the human element out of spiritual religious practice?
We don't. I mean, it's always there, and I think the real challenge is that we don't want to take the human element out of spirituality, is that we as human beings want to get closer to what that spirituality is all about and help others to see things differently. I mean, sometimes they'll succeed. I'm always reminded back in the civil rights days of a nun, Roman Catholic nun, who had her head cut open by a rock that was flying in Cicero, Illinois. And as she was being put into the ambulance, she was heard to say, what didn't we teach them? Or what didn't they hear? And we've got to constantly ask ourselves, how are we interpreting the message? How are we interpreting the story, our sacred texts, in such a way that it'll create a greater understanding for all people? That's the rub. And those who preach, those who wear the collars and the robes and whatnot, we're as human as the people in the pews, and some people misinterpret the message on both sides of the pulpit. But it's up to us to keep working at creating an atmosphere for people to hear the story, and for us who are responsible for telling the story, to tell the story correctly.
I hear that. And I'm going to go drifting off here for a second because, I really honor and cherish the message that Jesus carried. But I also look at the Gospels in a slightly different context. I put it into three contexts, and I'll get to the point in a second. I think I need to put the context. It's a spiritual text, the New Testament. It's a historical text. I also believe it's a marketing text. I believe that there's a part of what went in there that was, because Christianity was originally a sect of Judaism, trying to put the Jewish sects in a bad light to make the Christian sect look better, and not wanting to upset Rome, because Rome would have squashed them in a second if they were really getting them upset. So I'm laying this groundwork because within the text there is a place where Jesus is recorded as being very intolerant of the Pharisees and the Sadducees.
Right.
Now, if I accept the marketing aspect, I have a context for that statement. If I don't accept the marketing aspect, then isn't that a contradiction to all the other teachings?
Well, you have to look at it. If you look at it as a marketing text, which is an interesting way of looking at it, each one of the evangelists had a community, had an audience that they were interpreting the text for. Matthew, for instance, was probably writing to at least 4 different communities, trying to show how, in a reconciling way, these communities could come together around this story. Mark, from a very historical point of view, either before or after the war with Rome. And Luke, he was going to the Roman Empire. He was trying to say that this story, this text, is not only something that's appropriate here in the Middle East, but is appropriate for the world. And in a sense, Luke captures the spirit of the prophets of the Hebrew Scriptures, because there Isaiah and Amos and Hosea were preaching a universal message. John was preaching to a community that had ruptured from the synagogue, had been a painful rupture on both sides. And sure, you're right, within John especially, there's anti-Semitic implications. Matthew also has those. And I think some of that comes down to, again, we're just talking about humanity. These were human beings that wrote and were inspired to write a very sacred story. But our humanity oftentimes can get in the way. Hence conflict, hence differences, hence extremism that we're seeing in a lot of the intolerance, as you said, as you point out so well in the news.
And I don't want to put you on the spot, but then are we saying that we really, and especially for me alone, I love the King James version of the Bible because in theory everything in red is attributable to Jesus, and everything in black is commentary.
Yeah.
So I don't have to, I just read the red, So, for what you're saying then, even with the things that we are, quote, attributing to Jesus are running through a human filter, it may not be the exact same, the exact words that he used.
Right. If you and I right now try to retell the story of John Kennedy and John Kennedy's assassination 40 years after the fact, you and I would probably tell 2 different stories. And we're looking at people who wrote these, and as I would say, qualify that by saying we're inspired to write, decades after the actual events happened. So they're going to be interpreted differently. I had 2 professors in seminary in my Hebrew Scripture course that one day in their own offices sat down and just copied texts on notepaper from the Bible and then compared their notes afterwards and found the similarities between the 2 of them. It's how could I put it? It's how we receive the message, how we receive the story, how we internalize the story, and how we translate that story once we've received it. And my personal belief is that we translate that story to the wider world in order as Jews say tikkun olam, to repair the world, to heal relationships, to reconcile. We, as Christians, we say that we translate the story to the world in order to build up the kingdom of God here and now, which was another point of Luke's gospel, that he said the kingdom exists within us. And this is our responsibility, and people are gonna hear it differently. Not everybody hears the same story the same way.
That gets kind of scary then. How do we, I mean, that comes
It's called
to
the
solution.
Reformation.
Yeah. I mean, but then we'll get more into the solution, but
Right.
that really calls upon us to, then how, more than anything else, even if we're not hearing the same story, is to allow the different stories to be heard and told.
Mm-hmm.
I want to back up still more, because I mean, I'm throwing this at you because you're much more of a biblical scholar than I
Don't
am.
call me a biblical scholar. Few people.
I'm sorry?
I've spent a lot of time. Yes, indeed. Yeah,
Yes.
You're right. You're right.
So let's go back to Judaism for a second. The Old Testament is full of a wrathful, judgmental God, punishing God.
Right.
How do we reconcile a message that in that book, in books I should say, in the context of intolerance and striving for unity and diversity?
I'm going to answer that in a way that's probably not acceptable, because I don't have an answer for that. I get as upset with some of those texts as a lot of other people. There's one biblical scholar, I forget exactly her name, but as she refers to them as the text of terror.
Karen Armstrong?
No, it's not Karen Armstrong. It's a professor, I believe, from BU School of Theology. But you read the stories of violent deaths, an angry God, and that doesn't gel with the God that we are told is the God of love, the personal God that guides and oversees our lives. I come to those places in the Bible with as much, with as many questions as anybody else, and I wrestle with them. And that's when I look at the authors and say, that couldn't be the God of love and the God of personalism. It's the God that perhaps that particular author is trying to shape for a particular reason. I remember in seminary one Saturday going in for a celebration of the Eucharist, and the priest came down to the center to offer up the sermon, and she said that she couldn't make Jesus say what she wanted him to say, so she'd preach on Jeremiah that day.
Okay.
It's there's a lot of good theology there. I mean, we try and shape it for our ends when that's defeating it. So I think the answer to those those texts, those what I call those or was called those texts of terror, I think that's what you and I are going to find out about when we cross over, and I can wait until then. In the meantime, yes, they do cause trouble. They've caused wars. They've caused animosity, and they've caused a lot of unnecessary nationalism.
I would agree with that. You talked about extremists, fundamentalists. Are they really practicing religion, or are they practicing becoming a gang?
Not in my mind. That in my personal viewpoint, extremists, whether they be Islamic, Jewish, or Christian, are practicing more a psychology of anger and a psychology of hatred and a psychology of bigotry than they are practicing any form of religious belief. It boggles the imagination to think that what they're doing is religious. To me, that doesn't equate. It doesn't work out.
So we're going to have to deal with that along the way, and you and I, the show and society as a whole, because I mean, there just seems to be so much ego running wild, in this country, and we've kind of exported it to a lot of other areas. When we just that it's okay to do these things, and we live in fear, and fear leads to anger. And there's no tolerance when you're in fear and anger.
Yeah, we've entered into what, especially in recent history, we've entered into this culture of anger, this culture of hate, and this culture of bigotry, as I said before. I happen to think that so much of it has come out since President Obama has been elected, and so much of it, I think, is motivated by racism. I think that some groups feel that they now have permission to act out their hatred and act out their anger and their bigotry.
I agree with that, but unfortunately, I watch a little TV, and we're now getting into the election season. I mean, all I'm seeing on TV is attack thy opponent.
Right.
I see no dialogue about these are what I stand for. It's just let's attack them for what they've done. If I create or misinterpret. I mean, I hear what you're saying about this bigotry, but I just think as a society we've become more attack, anger.
We've
oriented.
lost. Yeah, we haven't lost, but the art of civil discourse is kind of disappeared, and we've put civil discourse and respecting the other. We've sort of seen that put on the sidelines by too many people, and I think this is where folks like you and I, who follow spiritual paths, have that obligation to, at least, if we're not going to change the world overnight, we're not going to change, stop war and create universal peace, but you and I and others, just on a local, one-on-one basis, oftentimes are going to do probably more good than we realize, and we just have to. I think we in the faith communities, for one thing, have to set an agenda that is based on the good society, on the kingdom, as we talk about it in Christianity, that we begin to see God's kingdom here and now through building up a just society, a just community, and rise above it. Just don't allow it to direct our discourse, our conversations, our agenda, and eventually let folks know that the extremists, the folks that are practicing all this non-civil discourse, really are welcome to the table if they just would tone their arguments down. I mean, you can well understand where people are getting angry these days to an extent. I mean, the economy is gripping us. We've been in this recession for so long. The unemployment statistics in this country are awful, and people are frustrated by that. But angry discourse and angry reaction to that isn't going to get us anywhere. We need to sit down with each other and say, what are we going to do to change things? What are we going to do to make this better? What are we going to do to create more jobs, or work with the government, work with the president to create more jobs?
Well, for me, I mean, I would start one of two places. Write in none of the above in the gubernatorial elections, or just have everybody not vote. I mean, to me, it sets...
Well, it's almost everybody not voting the way people...
it's pathetic.
Well...
I mean, these people call themselves leaders, and look where they're leading. I mean...
Well, they seem to be giving into each other's agenda, which is, more get into office. But I just can't help but think right here with the green technology building that's going up. I think green jobs and green employment are, a great wave of the future. And so, I mean, right here in this community college, there is hopeful enterprises. There are hopeful enterprises taking place. And I think by doing that, I think some, politicians follow the voters, and they're going to get off their argumentative wagons if they hear enough people are tired of it and are not going to vote for you if you're going to keep up this kind of a stridency. What we are going to vote for is somebody's going to take care of my job. Somebody who is going to maybe, if it's possible, to live with some tolerable taxation or something. But, you and I have talked about before the Dalai Lama's great statement that wherever he goes in the world, regardless of the tradition, what he finds is the common denominator among people is a desire for health and happiness. And you and I and others have got to work for that community of health and happiness.
And that's where ego
Sure.
and the fear gets in the way, how we think we can get it, But I don't want to get back onto politics, but just the little bit I've seen, there is nobody running for office that cares about.
Gets pretty mean-spirited.
Yeah, I mean, the health and happiness, doesn't care about spirituality.
Yeah.
I mean, I would be
But
amazed.
you and I have to work to pull the reins in on that, and I think just by letting folks know, get back. Start talking about the issues. Start talking about education. Start talking about employment. Start talking about better quality of life, reducing crime. These are the things that I remember my first reconciliation trip to Northern Ireland was meeting with a Protestant minister who was also a politician. And we were talking on very ethereal levels of, coming together and reconciling and bringing both Catholic and Protestant together. And, we're kind of up in an upper plane. And this guy just brought it right down to earth. And he said, listen, we got potholes to fill, and these are the things we've got to work on together, to go to our city councils and to go to our, our political leaders and say, we got to fill potholes. We've got to, build up the quality of school. And once you get into those issues, and excuse me, this is another area that I think is so important, that we need to get outside of ourselves. We're talking about the New Testament. The thing about Jesus that was so wonderful and is so wonderful, if you read his story, he never points to himself. He never points to me. He's always pointing to God, to the kingdom. He's always pointing outside of himself. And I think the subtext there is that once people begin working outside of themselves and find that we have a common humanity, follow that teaching from Jesus, which to me is universal. Doesn't matter whether you're Christian or Buddhist or whatever, but to look at Jesus pointing beyond himself to God and to the kingdom, that's a pretty awesome posture to take, but it calls us to do exactly the same in the here and the now. Get together to fix those potholes. Get together to build up, like here, I go back to this Green Technology Center here, create centers that hopefully someday will create a lot of jobs. So,
I think people are looking outside of themselves, but instead of looking for God, they're looking for scapegoats. Who do I blame for this? And again, this to me falls back. No, it doesn't fall back. The political arena emphasizes it and reinforces it, but it's everybody's basic fears. And somewhere along the way, they're not turning to religion and spirit to help them overcome those fears. We
don't listen to the other the way we should. St. Bede's recently hosted Bishop Gene Robinson. We had a luncheon for him when he was here in Santa Fe during Gay Pride Week, and he was Grand Marshal for the Pride Parade. And as he put it in his talk after lunch, he said, once you meet the other, once you meet your fellow human beings, and for people who have never met a gay person, once they meet that gay person, oftentimes some of the attitudes, some of the hostility, if it's there, some of the homophobia will begin to disappear. I've seen that more times than not in my own life, in meeting with people in cultures and in settings that I had never walked before, and sitting down with them and finding out we've got more in common than we really have in differences. And I think that's, we've got to transcend that fear of the other. We've got to transcend the fear of the outsider and find out that we're all brothers and sisters.
I agree with that. I just, and again, I'm playing a lot of devil's advocate here, but we fear what we do not understand. We fear what we do not know what you're saying. But if we let go of that fear, we have to look at ourselves. And it's easier, in spite of everything else, to not let go of that fear because I don't have to look at myself. it took a whole lot of pain for me to stop doing drugs. Because I didn't,
Right.
somewhere there was a part of me that knew I was the problem.
Right.
I didn't want to look at me.
Well, once we begin accepting responsibility for our actions, we're on the way to our own personal transformation. I spent 15 years as a probation officer before I went into seminary and was ordained. And whether an offender that I dealt with was 15 or 50, I would always say, usually in the first or second interview with the person, that you're more than likely going to keep repeating your offenses, and you're more than likely going to wind up incarcerated if you do not accept responsibility for your action, that you committed that offense, that you broke into that house, that you got behind the wheel, you were a drunk driver, that you did this. Until you own up to that, and then once you own up to it, the second step to that is finding out that you have a responsibility to the other. You have a responsibility to the community not to get behind the wheel of a wheel drunk, not to drink and drive. You have the responsibility not to break into the house, but to go out and become a productive member of society. But it all begins with, I'm responsible for my actions. And granted, there are all sorts of circumstances in our lives that sometimes can mitigate strongly against success, but we have to use our bounden determination to overcome that. But I think we go a long way the minute we begin to accept responsibility for our actions. And too many times you see people who will limp through life, as I like to say, simply because they can find everybody else to blame but themselves.
Yeah, I agree.
I love the old saying. It's corny, but it's true. You point one finger at a person, you're pointing four back at yourself. And but it's getting over that hurdle of, and once, you and I know it, I'm a member of a 12-step program, I'm a recovering alcoholic. Once you find out in the program that you've got a disease and you can overcome it by admitting your problem, admitting your responsibility, the road to transformation begins when you surrender yourself to God.
Surrender
Surrender
is the key. Yeah, I agree. And I watch it happen, but I see so much of it not happening, and it gets, I think it gets us to what we're talking about.
Well, it can get discouraging, it can get frustrating, but you keep working at it, because simply going back to spirituality, we need to constantly be aware that we're not doing this alone, that God's with us in all this, that God, can get us through the darkest moments. I have a simple thing that I tell my congregation that, when I'm in a situation that's going to be a little untenuous, I just oftentimes just take my hands and say, okay, God, it's up to you. I can't do it anymore. And I jokingly tell them that's gotten me into dentist offices, I stand at the door, and, you get me in there, God, I can't do it. You get me sober, God, I'll do it one day at a time, but, I need your presence in my life to continue to do it. And I think the other thing too is we can, I know it's probably a modern fault, we can make our lives more complicated than they should be.
That leads me to the last point I want to touch on, of the factors that come into intolerance. What are your thoughts on the differences between science and religion, and science creating another level of intolerance?
Science in and of itself, I don't think, can create another level of intolerance. I listened to Stephen Hawking the other night on Larry King. It was a brilliant show. And Deepak Chopra is the co-author of Hawking's book. It was brilliant. And they were getting into the dialogue between science. I don't think science in and of itself creates intolerance. Science can lead some to believe that science is the ultimate answer, that all we need to know is what we have learned factually and empirically through scientific investigation and scientific experiment, when in fact I am convinced, and I know a lot of scientists will say, you will only go so far with that until you just reach an unknown. And with Hawking's, I applaud him for his research. But as you keep going back into the mystery of the universe, you're going to reach what Aristotle called the uncaused cause, and that's God, and that's mystery. And I think one of the dangers of science by itself is the absence of mystery, and I think religion brings that element, that layer of mystery that we can just honestly say at some point, I don't know, or I think I always go back to Heidegger, who in his analysis of being tried to pick up where Aristotle left off. Aristotle had come to a point in his own analysis of being, said, I can't go any further. I can't understand it completely. And Heidegger comes along and says, well, I can pick up where Aristotle left off, and attempts to do it, and created this great philosophy and all his hard work. But then he comes to a point and he says that the only way I can understand being is through art, through music, through poetry. That stuff that takes us into the area of what I call meta-language, or what a lot of philosophers would call meta-language, that we have to stand there in awe. And I think once we stand there in awe, we have begun to meet God.
Science become a religion?
Sure.
I mean, so we have a religion with a non-religious context.
Well, even Bonhoeffer in World War II said that he talked about a religionless Christianity. I've never quite figured out what he meant by that. But any field of study or investigation can be, if we look at it in and of itself. But I have to say that where I come from is different. I just don't accept that it should become a religion. I'm currently doing research on a wonderful 19th century English priest by the name of Frederick Denison Morris, who was great on many levels in terms of his theology, and said that theology is the ground of all sciences, and I really believe that.
I don't disagree with that. Again, just what goes on in this country between the sciences and what you put in textbooks and what you don't put in textbooks, and is this provable science? Is it all theory? It creates another level of diversity and another level or another place to find and practice fear and intolerance.
I think good science in textbooks in schools, especially in elementary and high schools, should be presented in such a way that it allows the student to keep asking questions, to keep, to open up new doors, to entice somebody to say, what's behind those stars, what's behind those chemicals, to begin to explore what is it that makes up this universe, like the physicist would, the theoretical physicist.
Which is going to start getting us into the solutions, which is about time. But I just want to put out three things before we start the solutions, because it was interesting research. The First Amendment to the Constitution, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Then it goes on for some other stuff. But so we have the first constitutional amendment guarantees freedom of religion. There's no state-sanctioned religion. The United Nations basically has the same thing. It's Article 18 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and the European Union has basically a Human Rights Act, which is basically the same thing. So, and maybe we shouldn't go out of the country, but most of the world acknowledges these rights, and I guess this is the place where we need to maybe start doing something more about promoting them and enforcing them, or...
Oh, absolutely, enforce them. That's why we have the courts. That's why we have the International Criminal Court, courts, Human Rights Court through the EU. I remember Martin Luther King saying during the Civil Rights days, he said, passing laws isn't going to make you love me, but it's going to stop you from hanging me. We need to, and that's what we need to resort to in terms of what we're talking about earlier, that cuts down on a lot of the violent conflict if we bring those differences, and if we would respect and honor those courts. I think the United States doesn't recognize some of the international courts on human rights, and they haven't signed on, and always afraid of war crime accusations and charges. But I think the courts are a great place to start for countries and societies to maybe not come together so much, but to get their rights established and enforced.
Let's go to, we've been talking quite a bit and running out of time soon. Your specialty application, so to speak, is peace and reconciliation. You've had some wonderful experiences about unity and diversity. Can you share one or two of them?
Yeah, one of the reasons, I'll give you the examples in a minute. That's one of the reasons I'm a happy Episcopalian, because at the heart of our doctrine and our belief is exactly that phrase, unity in the midst of diversity. I have said more times than not, and you've heard me say more times than not, my work in Northern Ireland, I have sat in rooms with people who have been the bitterest of enemies, who had been shooting at each other years before, and oftentimes through an experience within the prison system over there, as a lot of them were incarcerated in a place they call the Maze, which really I think became a seedbed for the peace process. A lot of them learned the futility of shooting at each other and come out and have started working together. And when I've seen some former enemies working together for such things as economic development, youth work, community development, community organizing, without giving up their political and religious beliefs, but able to sit at the same table like that politician I was talking about. We got potholes to fix. And I've seen more examples of that happen than that have led me to believe of the human capacity to work together, to build up the community in the midst of differences, in the midst of personal beliefs and religious beliefs. So I'll end it at that. But I've seen it happen.
So then, what we're really saying is that the message is
go to prison.
Maybe. Is the message that basically, my organization is Church of the One God. I believe in the best way to describe it is that we're all worshiping the same entity. We choose different ways to do that. It's like this huge mountain.
Right.
And we're all wanting to get to the top of the mountain, and there's a variety of different paths up the mountain, and we just argue over the path. So are we saying that it's the real simplest solution is that what he says, what Sri Chinmoy says, it's the absolute recognition of the other's faith in God as one's own?
That's precisely what Gandhi said on one occasion, in which somebody asked him what his religion was, and he said, when I'm with Muslims, I'm a Muslim. When I'm with Christians, I'm a Christian, and when I'm with Hindus, I'm a Hindu. It's stepping into the other's world, not completely divorcing yourself from your own world. This is unity in the midst of diversity we're talking about. So I think for me to step into the world of the Hindu or the Muslim or the Jew is something that I enjoy doing, while at the same time realizing that I've got something to bring to that table as well as they have got something to bring. We can't go so far into each other's that we lose our own identity. This is because I think at the core of all reconciliation projects is the issue of identity, but that's a whole subject for another thing. But the joke that comes to mind that I recently heard was that I think it was a journalist in Northern Ireland got up at a meeting one night and announced that he was an atheist. And a woman stood up and he says, well, is it the God of the Protestants or the God of the Catholics you don't believe in?
That's good. But exactly that. The allowing of somebody else to have a different belief which goes back in a lot of ways to the eradication of ego, because ego basically says if my ego is damaged, which unfortunately I think most people's egos are, then I cannot allow for differences, because differences make me insecure as opposed to me growing. So it's about really that eradication of ego and saying, yeah, you have your belief, I have my belief.
But oftentimes,
how do we leave it to the side?
You're going to sit with the other person oftentimes and find out that they're just as insecure and just as fearful as you are. And then once you begin talking, and once you begin to find out that you have certain things in common, or that you just get along. I was raised in a Irish nationalist family in New Haven, Connecticut. That had being Irish meant being for a united Ireland. One of my closest friends right now in Northern Ireland is a retired major from the British military. My poor mother would probably be rolling over in her grave if she knew about it. But and the reason that John and I have become such good friends is that we have just talked and gotten to know each other, and I can count more friends on that within that world than I ever would have thought possible 15 years ago. But it was just getting to know him.
And having the crisis enough to bring together that dialogue.
Right. And the crisis is that we want an end to the violence, and we want an end to the struggle, and we want that peaceable kingdom, so to speak.
So we have a working model. It's worked, it continues to work. Why do you think it's not being applied more places? Israel and...
I'm the eternal optimist. I think it is at work in Israel, and I think it is at work in the Middle East. It's just going to take a longer time. One of the things you learn in reconciliation work very early on is that the work of reconciliation and the work of conflict resolution demands, and I underscore demands, a tremendous amount of patience, because it doesn't happen overnight. And the second rule is that it's complicated, that the issues are never black and white, that there's always stuff below the surface that has to be understood. So patience and understanding complexity, along with the identity issues and other things that we talked about, are so critical.
One of the things that you and I talked about the other day was interfaith events. I mean, that obviously becomes a part of this. Is that the precursor, or is that the result of this peace and reconciliation, or is it both?
I think it's being a good Anglican with believing in ambiguity. Yeah, both. No, what I think it is we're finding out interfaith dialogue hasn't been as common as it has been only within the last few years. I, for years, was always involved in ecumenical work, Christians within Christians, Protestant, Catholic, so on and so forth. And it's only been within recent years that I've found myself engaged in interfaith work, and it's simply out of, it begins with that we've got more in common than we understand. And also, this world is so troubled right now, we have no right to stay in our own little camps. We need to be with each other. And then the final thing is that, going back to my hero, F.D. Morris, who said that we've all got a piece of the truth to bring to the table. Nobody has the whole pie, that we've all got a piece of the pie. But even that is causing conflict within some places within Christianity, with in the more conservative and traditionalist, not the resistance of coming together. But I think the more we find out that we need each other, we're going to begin changing things. And we need to hear how our brothers and sisters know God, how our brothers and sisters pray, how our brothers and sisters dialogue with God and dialogue with each other about God, and enter into those conversations and spiritual experiences.
I want to jump in here. We're starting to run down. I want to make a couple of quick announcements, give you a chance to let people know when services are and everything. Right. And then we're going to come back with the final little thought. So, first off, this is public access television. That means you, the public, have access to us. So if there's anything that you would like for me to cover, any topic you'd like for me to go over, or you think you have something you want to say and we could put it on the air, contact me. That's been flashing on the screen. It'll run at the end of the show as well. Let me know what it is you want to hear and don't want to hear. Also, want to announce next week my guest will be Rabbi Marvin Schwab from Temple Beth Shalom. It was a show we were trying to do before the high holidays, but technical difficulties prevented it, so we're going to do it right after them. Also want to put out there, we've touched on it, and I touch on it a lot. I am a counselor. I'm a spiritual counselor. I believe that spirituality is the only way we heal. We don't heal by thinking better. We're not going to feel better, and heal. We need to really work on our spirit. So that's what I do, and I work on a donation basis. So if you think that there are problems in life that you need help with, and that spirit might be the path that you want to explore, contact me. I'd be happy to work with you. Do you want to let people know service schedule for St. Bede's?
Services at St. Bede's are Sundays at 8 and 10:30 with childcare, and most Sundays an adult education forum at 9:15. Our child care and Sunday school program begins at around 10:15. And then midweek we have a service of Celebration of Holy Eucharist and Healing on Wednesdays at 12:15.
Okay. I forget the exact phrase he used. What was the guy's name? Johnson, who was the pastor over at Westminster.
Britt Johnson?
Britt, yeah.
Britt Johnson, yeah.
I had him on a show on the radio once, and we were talking, I forget what the topic was, and I was just kind of expressing my beliefs to him. And I think he called me a universalist. So, I mean, if that wasn't the term, so be it. But I guess what I want to get to, we talked about, it's the absolute recognition of the other's faith in God as one. My studies, however intense or incomplete, whichever way you want to look at them, I see religions all teaching the same thing. There's been writings about it. Aldous Huxley, The Perennial Philosophy.
Yeah.
I got a couple of quotes here. I'll just try to do, the golden rule. So Luke is, and this is, I'm not sure what Bible this comes out of, treat others as you want them to treat you. Then Confucius, do not do to others what you do not want the others to do to you. Jewish rabbi by the name of Hillel, what is hateful to you, do not do to your friend. And then even like the Wiccan Reed is do whatever you wish as long as it harms nobody, including yourself. I mean, and I believe that there is this underlying commonality to all the religions. Is there any way to utilize that to help break down the intolerance? Or do you think that'll just force people to be more defensive?
No, I think one of the reasons we have so many religions is people need different ways to express and live out their faith in God. What do we do with that? I think primarily we learn to live together, to I don't like the use of the word of tolerance, and also I believe in Chamoy's thesis there in the beginning, but how we all learn to live together with each other in coming together to God. I think it was, Teilhard de Chardin, and talk about the Alpha and the Omega, how we're on this trajectory towards oneness with God. But he wasn't talking about that just within Catholicism. I think he was talking about it within a universal pilgrimage, so to speak, for lack of a better word, of we're all going towards that God. I might be the same universalist you are. We're all heading there.
Too much.
And someday we just pray that the sun will shine on all of us, and be a better world. But I think there's no single answer to it except that you and I can come together at this forum with from different religious perspectives and have a great friendship. And in that sense, there's a grace in that. I think that grace that comes from that friendship, has an effect one way or another on the people and communities outside of us. And I think that's, another show we could talk about, but we all bring, if we believe in God in a very loving and positive way, we all bring a grace to the world.
I agree. So in the last couple of minutes, if you leave the viewing audience with one thought, one message, what would that be?
Great words of wisdom. I'd fall right back on Rodney King. Why can't we all get along? And let's find ways to get along. And I think one of the ways we can learn to get along is through walking with God as we understand God, together. Not separately, but together.
And that would...
It's going to change the world. You and I are going to transform the world. It's going to be poof. It's going to happen overnight.
There was a great saying, I forget who it was. I wish I could remember. I have to look it up again. But that each one of us, our job is to be in the moment, representing and acting as if God was supposed to show up and couldn't, and asked us to take its place.
There you go. Yeah.
And that to me is just like, that's it. We hear what I talk about at the end of my shows all the time. We are one with God. All we got to do is just reach inside and demonstrate it. Right. I don't believe we have to let God in. I believe we have to let God out.
Yeah, amen to that one.
So hopefully, if we haven't solved any problems, we've raised some questions. Maybe we can do another show. Maybe we can do a forum. I don't know. Maybe we need to get more people together. I put this together kind of quickly.
Well, at the last minute. So, yeah.
I just got tired of the things I was seeing about burning the Quran and the problems with the mosque at Ground Zero. Right. And then even yesterday's paper. I mean, the State Board of Education of Texas wanting to ban books because they talk too much about the Islamic faith and not enough about the Christian faith.
It's plain ignorance. That's all you can say.
In my sense of unity and diversity, I would suggest that because of the death penalty and all their other good things, we ought to let Texas become their own country. Anyway.
With that, you'll sign off.
With that,
you've just lost Texas.
That's not a great loss in my opinion.
I didn't say that.
I know, I did. So I want to thank you all for tuning in. You hear the message here. Please, don't just, that's nice conversation and go back to the things you're doing. Be aware of your reactions, be aware of your emotions, your behavior, and ask yourself, am I demonstrating the divine? God has put me here to represent it. Am I demonstrating that? And if you're not, prayer, meditation, affirmations, contemplations will get you back there. So thank you all for tuning in. Thank you for being with me
Phil,
today.
Thank you. It's been wonderful.
And know that you are one with God. Every religion teaches that. That's one of my universalists. And just let God out. Demonstrate it. Love and light to you all. Blessings. I'm Reverend Phil, and I've been your host for Words of the Prophets. Thank you for tuning in. Please join me again next week, same time, same channel, for more Words of the Prophets.